Hello, everybody. Welcome to the inaugural podcast of Amerikan Rambler. I am Colin Woodward. This is the very first podcast I've ever done on my own. I'm doing it here in my study in Colonial Beach, Virginia. This is the first podcast that, I've been on a podcast before back in Little Rock when I was working there. But it wasn't a podcast that I did on my own. I was just kind of a guest talking about Johnny Cash. So I don't have a lot of experience talking into a mic. I think I've only spoken into a mic a few times in my entire life. Once was at my wedding. Once was when I was talking about Johnny Cash on stage. That was at a different venue in Little Rock. But that was pretty exciting. That was more of a spoken word thing. Anyway, don't want to get too ahead of myself. First of all, who am I and why am I doing this? Why am I doing this is a better question. I can somewhat easily talk about who I am. I am a doctor of history. I got my PhD at Louisiana State University in 2005. But to back up a little bit, I was born in Massachusetts. I graduated from high school there. Did my undergraduate at Trinity College in Hartford, and then I went on to LSU, which was a place I knew virtually nothing about before I went there. In fact, I had never been south of the Hudson River. New York City was as far south as I had been before I went to Baton Rouge. So as you can imagine, there's a little bit of culture shock. But I have since gone native. I was at LSU for 8 years, and other than a year where I was at Smith College, I have lived in the South for my entire adult life. And I actually have a blog that's called Southern Historian, both because I live in the South and because I study the South. But I didn't want to call this podcast Southern Historian because I didn't necessarily want it to be about history. I wanted it to be about kind of whatever, really. Movies, books, history, certainly. What's going on in the news, I don't know. I don't really know where this might go. I might go nowhere. This might be the only one of these that I ever do. I might do 100. I don't know. I've been a blogger for a long time. And the first blog that I ever had was called Amerikan Rambler, hence the name of this podcast. And I always liked that name. I had to spell it American with a K because when I was on Blogger at first, someone else had taken Amerikan Rambler with a C in American. So I had to change it a little bit. And so it was American with a K. And I kind of liked that because of sometimes you see politics spelled with a K, and for some reason having the K in there made me think of Kafka and how things can be very Kafkaesque at times. So it's a little bit different than the usual spelling of American, but that's kind of how I liked it. Although I haven't been in that blog in a long time. I got rid of it actually and went on to the Southern Historian blog. So anyway, I have been a blogger for a while, and that's kind of fun, but I almost wonder if blogging is kind of going by the wayside these days. From my own experience, I think that blogging is an extremely time-consuming and ultimately not very rewarding activity. It has been fun to write a lot of things over the years, and sometimes people comment, mostly they don't. But I think once you get to the age that I am with children and a full-time job, it gets harder and harder to blog. And so part of the reason why I'm doing a podcast is because I still want to put my ideas out there, get my point of view out there, but I don't necessarily have the time to write things that the way I used to, and I certainly love writing and do it all the time, but I probably don't speak as much as I should, and maybe doing a podcast will help me become a better talker. I've never been a huge talker. I can do my fair share at times, and right now I have a glass of red wine, which is certainly helping, and who knows where this might go if I keep talking. But it kind of feels like getting up on stage when you get in front of a microphone. And the two are all often come together. If you're on stage, a lot of the time you're talking to a microphone, and there's something very scary about it when you're amplifying your own voice, especially when it's in front of an audience. I'm not in front of an audience right now. Even my wife isn't here. She's in bed. It's late. It's past 10 on a Monday night, so we have to be quiet. Both the kids are in bed. So I'm a little tired. Full day, then you watch the kids at night. But anyway, talked a little bit about where I'm from and what I've been up to. One of the reasons why I like the Amerikan Rambler name is because I've felt like a rambler the last, 10 years, 15 years, moving to Baton Rouge and then moving to Virginia for a job, living in Richmond for 5 years. Right around the time the 5-year point was when the economy tanked, if you remember that, as I'm sure pretty much everybody does, how bad it was in 2008 and 2009 to find a job. So I was able to get a job at Smith College, but it was only for a year. And then after that year, had to move to Little Rock, Arkansas, to work at a archive there. And stayed there for about 3.5 years. And now I am back in Virginia. And the place I'm in now is Colonial Beach, which, as you can imagine, is by the beach. It's not the beach the way you might think of it in Florida or even Virginia Beach. It is where the Potomac River goes into the Atlantic. And it's probably more river than ocean, I would say here, although it is quite nice along the water. The Potomac is very wide at this point. It's about 4 miles wide in places. But it's nice to be by the water. We're not very far from the water. And Colonial Beach is a small town. Seen better days, gotta say. It's only about 3,000 people, smaller than the town that I even grew up in Massachusetts. And Colonial Beach is a, shall we say, conservative place. Good folks here, friendly, very neighborly at times. But it is also the kind of place where you see a lot of "Don't Tread on Me" license plates and Confederate flags in people's yards. There's a guy a couple blocks from here who has a Confederate flag flying, not only on his porch, he has one on his license plate, or at least the license plate of the person who was parked in front of his house the other day had a Confederate flag on the license plate. So 2 Confederate flags, which, is definitely proving your conservative credentials, I think. But also you do see a lot of the "Don't Tread on Me" flags, sometimes on people's golf carts. This is a golf cart town. People zip all around in their golf carts, which, hey, if that's what you want to do, that's fine. If you don't want to walk and you don't want to drive your car, I think the golf cart is a nice in-between. But you do see those "Don't Tread on Me" flags. And it has the snake on them. It's something from the Revolution. As a historian, I kind of know the whole history of that. But it's come back, I think, because of the Tea Party. And I do see a lot of Tea Party friendly signs and whatnot here. So anyway, it's a very conservative town. A lot of hunters. Sometimes you see more hunters than anyone else on certain days. They're up early. They're out there in the woods doing their thing, getting those deer. I'm not a hunter, but I have seen deer up close. Most recently, I've seen them at work. I work at Stratford Hall, which is in the middle of the woods. That's where my office is. It's not far from the Potomac. And if you don't know, Stratford Hall is the birthplace of Robert E. Lee. Yes, Robert E. Lee, the famous general, was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, in the Northern Neck. And Robert E. Lee went on to become a famous general during the Civil War. But there's a lot of other history here, not just the Civil War. Actually, there's not a lot of Civil War history around here. That's more in the Richmond area and other parts. But we have 3 presidents who were born not too far from here. George Washington, whose birthplace, at least the sign for it, I pass every day in work. That's not far from here. James Madison was born not too far down the road. And also James Monroe, who was born just a few minutes from here by car. So 3 presidents. And there's a reason why they called it the Virginia Dynasty early on, because you had Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, all from Virginia in the first couple of decades of the United States history. And since then, Westmoreland County has fallen on hard times. It's a bit of a economically distressed area. But like I said, the people are friendly. There's a lot of nice scenery, and it is what it is. It's the Northern Neck. So we're here by the beach. We're getting used to things, coming all the way from Arkansas. Not a whole lot of culture shock, I gotta say. If you've been in Arkansas and you come to the Northern Neck, not too far apart, really. But certainly Little Rock is a lot bigger than where I'm living now. But obviously we're not too far from D.C. We're not too far from Richmond. Anyway, so that's kind of where I'm at. And I guess what I wanted to talk about today is maybe a bit of a weird subject for a historian to talk about. But one thing I've always been into is movies. And I don't get to see nearly as many as I used to when I was younger. My teens and 20s, saw a lot of movies. It's kind of when you start educating yourself on movies, I think. Although it really started when I was very young. My dad always took me to the movies and saw a lot of great movies in the early 80s, from the Indiana Jones movies to Star Wars to whatever looked good that was playing. We would usually get to see with my dad, and my mom would certainly take us sometimes too, but those, I think, kind of a father-son thing, to see Star Trek, to see Return of the Jedi, to see Ghostbusters, all that kind of good stuff in the 80s. So don't get to the movies as often as I used to. Usually if I go now, I go with my wife. And recently we saw the new James Bond movie. And what I wanted to talk a little bit about today was James Bond. Not just the new movie, but also kind of the history of James Bond, and maybe a little about the tone of James Bond and how that has changed in my lifetime, but also in the history of the franchise. This was Daniel Craig's 4th turn as Bond in the Spectre movie. The previous one was Skyfall. And I think when Craig came on board a few years ago, when he did Casino Royale, it really rebooted the franchise. But now I'm saying that it's maybe time for him to move along. And I don't want to be too hard on him, because I think Craig is a good actor and he certainly has a lot of presence. But I have some issues with the James Bond movies recently that I'll get into. But first, just to talk a little bit about the James Bond that I knew. I'm going to sound like an old man here, but back in my day, there were really only 2 James Bonds that anyone cared about. There was Sean Connery, who was the first James Bond, and Roger Moore, who came after him. There was one guy who came in between named George Lazenby, but no one ever really talked much about him, because he only did one movie, because Sean Connery bowed out before Roger Moore came on. They did one Bond movie. Anyway, there was pretty much Sean Connery and there was Roger Moore. And there were 2 armed camps when it came to James Bond movies. You were either a Sean Connery guy or you were more of a Roger Moore guy. And I certainly never had anything against Sean Connery. I thought he was a great Bond. I think some of those movies are good that he did. But I also think Roger Moore did some really good James Bond movies, and I kind of liked his style and his personality as Bond more than Sean Connery. And usually the politically correct answer was to say that Sean Connery was the best Bond, but I you know, who the hell knows? But I always kind of liked Roger Moore more because I liked the Roger Moore movies. I don't think it was necessarily just Roger Moore. If you know, maybe if you put Sean Connery in some of the later ones, I would have liked those movies even better. But I like the Roger Moore movies partly because they were set in the 1970s, and there's just something great about 1970s movies. You know, certainly that was when all the great directors that are around now were cutting their teeth, guys like Scorsese and Lucas and Spielberg and everything. And even though the James Bond movies weren't nearly as good as a lot of those, you know, certainly Scorsese or Spielberg, they were very fun. And before my family had a VCR, we could watch a lot of movies on television. And again, back in my day, there was only 3 networks. There was ABC, CBS, and NBC. Some people did have cable. We certainly did not. Most of the people that I knew didn't have cable for a long time. I didn't get cable until I was in my 30s. But anyway, the 3 networks would show movies a lot. Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night. This was in the age before people had VCRs, certainly before anything was on demand or DVDs or anything. They would play movies, and the local channels would play movies all the time too. But I distinctly remember that ABC was the network that played the James Bond movies, and I think they used to play them on Sunday nights usually, either at 7 or 8 or whenever it was. I remember watching them when it was light out, so it couldn't have been too late on Sunday in the summertime. But they would play all the James Bonds from Goldfinger on up to Living Daylights or whatever. I think around the time I was getting into James Bond, Roger Moore was getting too old, and a new guy was coming on. But for years and years, it was Roger Moore, and before him, Sean Connery. And I really loved watching those Roger Moore Bonds on TV. I mean, the Sean Connerys were good too, but something like The Spy Who Loved Me, I thought was a great Bond movie. I still think it's probably one of the best, if not the best, Bond movies. And I think what I liked about the Bond movies at first were really the locations. I mean, the plots are pretty ridiculous, and the acting isn't great, certainly. But I think what I liked about them was that they were sexy, but also they had great locations. And I think some of the Roger Moore movies have the best location shots of any of the Bond movies. And one Roger Moore Bond that I like that a lot of people don't was The Man with the Golden Gun, which has some really cool locations. One of them is in Macau. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, in China. But the villain from Golden Gun is Scaramanga, and he's this assassin who has a house in a giant rock that's on an island out in the ocean, and he has his own beach, and he has his own generator, of course, and all these crazy Bond villain things. But I thought that was always an interesting Bond movie because it wasn't quite as big as some of the other ones. It was kind of more of a one-on-one at the end with Bond and this villain Scaramanga. But I this is probably too strong a word maybe to use for that movie, but it's very elegant as far as Bond movies go. And you know, it's just so dumb, but is really a lot of fun, and makes me nostalgic whenever I think about it. You're a teenager watching James Bond, and he's got all these beautiful women around and everything. But anyway, that's kind of one reason why I like the Roger Moore's. Moonraker is pretty stupid and not so good, but then there's Live and Let Die, which is okay. That's kind of a mess, but again, very colorful, interesting locations. I think that's the only Bond movie that has significant African American characters. Bond movie's not known for that, but Anyway, there was Sean Connery and there was Roger Moore for the longest time, and then Pierce Brosnan came along, and that's when I thought the franchise took a real downturn. And I think getting Daniel Craig on board was a way of getting Bond back on track, and a bit tricky because we don't live in the Cold War anymore. Bond was this Cold War warrior. He was fighting the Russians a lot of the time, not necessarily in every movie, but everyone knew who the real villain was in the real world, which was the Soviet Union, and Bond was supposed to be saving us from that. But by fast forward to the 2000s when Daniel Craig comes on board, obviously the Soviet Union is long gone. Russia is still a country, and people don't like Vladimir Putin very much. But we've got a different enemy now, globally speaking, which is obviously terrorism that comes out of the Mideast and all that comes with that. But the first Daniel Craig movie, Casino Royale, didn't really deal with that. It was kind of a throwback to the very first James Bond movie that was ever made, which was Casino Royale. Although the Sean Connery was not in that. The first one that he did was Dr. No. But there was a kind of off-brand Casino Royale that was made. I think it was maybe even in the late 50s. It wasn't even in the 1960s. Anyway, it was a throwback to the very first Bond movie, and I thought it was great. The Daniel Craig Casino Royale, and the woman in that movie, Eva Green, I just thought was amazing. If you've ever seen that movie, The Dreamers, she's just amazing in that. Just a very brave actress, and The Dreamers is pretty out there. If you're not into NC-17 movies, don't see it. But if you are into out there movies that are philosophical and sexual, it's kind of like The Unbearable Lightness of Being, but darker even, I would say. But anyway, Eva Green was in that, and that was a great movie. And I thought she was very good in Casino Royale, giving the movie some gravitas. And Daniel Craig was just so refreshing after that ridiculous Pierce Brosnan being in a bunch of, I think he was in 4 Bond movies. And I kind of gave up on the franchise for a while. I think I saw the first 2 Pierce Brosnan movies, and I just hated them, and I couldn't understand why they chose him. I think before Pierce Brosnan came on board, or maybe it was after him, some people were talking about Clive Owen, which I thought would kind of been a good choice for Bond. But anyway, when they announced Daniel Craig, I was kind of surprised, because he always looked more like when I saw him, I didn't know anything about Daniel Craig, but when I first saw him, I thought he looked more like a Bond villain than James Bond should look like. I mean, Daniel Craig is this kind of hulking, scary-looking guy with blonde hair, and I think if he had not been James Bond, he would have been a great Bond villain. But casting him was kind of against the grain, and sometimes that's a good thing. And Casino Royale was great. Now, the follow-up, Quantum of Solace, was pretty awful, I thought. I can't remember anything about it. I think all I can remember is it was just a mess in the desert somewhere. I don't even remember. I'm sure there were car chases and a lot of stuff happened. I know that sounds stupid to say, but that's sort of my default review for a lot of movies now. A lot of stuff happened in the desert, and I don't remember a damn thing about it. I think the most recent Mad Max movie, that would be my review. A lot of stuff happened in the desert, and I don't remember anything. That's kind of a comment on movies in general right now. But anyway, so after that, you get Skyfall, which I thought was pretty good. Certainly better than Quantum of Solace. You get more of a backstory with James Bond. They actually go to the Scottish manor that he was raised in, hence the name of the movie Skyfall, because in Europe they name they give buildings fancy names, or they give them names at all. There's a Kinks song where Ray Davis says, all the houses on the street have got a name because all the houses on the street, they look the same. And I think that's why they give names to buildings in Europe. Or if you're just rich, you just name your building because that's what rich people do. But anyway, you have Skyfall, and that's where James Bond came from. And the movie ends there, which I thought was very effective, unlike almost every James Bond movie that came before, ending it in Scotland in this very dark nighttime shooting that they did, and was a nice ending to that movie. That was otherwise, it was pretty good. I felt kind of bad for Javier Bardem because he was so good in No Country for Old Men, and in Skyfall he did what he could, but when you were the bad guy in No Country for Old Men, there's really no way to top that. And he's actually done some good comedy work in that Woody Allen movie that he did, Vicky Cristina Barcelona, which I thought was a kind of a fun movie. It was sort of slight, I guess, by Woody Allen standards, but looked great, and people look great, of course, in it, and it was kind of interesting. But Skyfall was okay, mostly. I did like the ending, but you start to see problems over the course of a couple movies with the same actor doing the same thing, and it's kind of a thankless role, really, to take on James Bond. It's kind of like being Dracula or Santa Claus or something. It's one of those roles that's so iconic that if you keep doing it, if you're the guy who's Santa every year at the mall, after a while the kids are gonna, maybe not the little kids, but the adults might start picking apart your routine a little bit. Or if you're not quite as beardy this year as you were last year, or your costume is starting to look a little ragged, the adults, the more observant adults anyway, might start to notice and kind of start picking your shtick apart. And I think Daniel Craig is a smart enough actor to know that he's pushing his luck with every movie, especially since they haven't been the most recent one isn't that great. I didn't think it was all that great. It was okay. But I think Daniel Craig started to look a little tired. He felt a lot like he was going through the motions, very stoic. There were a few attempts at humor, but he's just not a funny actor, let's face it, and doesn't really have any sense of irony whatsoever as James Bond. I mean, not that Bond is an extremely three-dimensional character, but I think he's way too physical for Bond, and is more of an action character than Bond ever was before. I mean, certainly Sean Connery could bring it, and Roger Moore could bring it sometime. Not so much Roger Moore. I think he was more of a kind of a, I don't know, hey, look at me in this scene, I'm James Bond kind of guy. Very more sly than Connery was. Connery was more on the action side. But one thing I liked about the first Indiana Jones movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, is that after all this punishment Indiana Jones is taking, there's a scene with him and his girlfriend Marion on this boat, and there's sort of a lull in the action for a little while. And Indiana Jones is kind of taking inventory on all the punishment he's been taking. At that point, he's been dragged behind a truck. He's been, shot at by 1,000 Nazis and beaten up and every damn thing. And he's just kind of laying in bed. He's just miserable and he's sore. And he looks in the mirror, and it's one of those old mirrors that can flip around. And his girlfriend on the other side doesn't see him looking in the mirror, and she flips it, and it goes up underneath his chin. And in real life, it would just be incredibly horrifyingly painful, and just whaps him right underneath the chin. And Spielberg cuts away from the shot. He doesn't show it, but you hear Indiana Jones scream. And it's a funny scene, but it also kind of shows the vulnerability of the Indiana Jones character, and that even though he's a superhero saving the world from Nazi Germany, he's taking a beating, and he's obviously not a 25-year-old ultimate fighter. He's just kind of a guy. He's a professor, and he is running around the world trying to save these relics from the bad guys. And obviously he takes a lot of punishment. And that scene is so great because Harrison Ford just knows how to play it with this humanity and this vulnerability. And I thought of that scene when I was watching the new James Bond movie, because there's nothing like that in this movie. I mean, Daniel Craig just goes from scene to scene. He's just indestructible. He gets just beaten to a pulp and seen on a train, and it's a long drawn out fight scene, but obviously any real person couldn't take that kind of punishment. And I know it's a James Bond movie and it's fantasy, but there's just never a scene where he is licking his wounds, and I think that would maybe a good thing if you're trying to be a better Bond movie, to kind of put these human touches in it. But it's just location to location and set piece to set piece and action to action. And it's kind of surprising, given that the director is Sam Mendes, and Mendes has directed stuff that is, earlier in his career was more dramatic. He was the guy that did American Beauty, and he did Revolutionary Road, which I thought was a great movie with Leonardo and Kate Winslet. So Sam Mendes is more of a drama guy, kind of an interiors type of director. So that they chose him to do the last James Bond movies, I thought was kind of strange. And I think his tone for directing James Bond is way off. I mean, not only does he not really have a great ear for comedy, at least in his earlier movies, he has an ear for black comedy sometimes. American Beauty was certainly kind of a black comedy in some ways. But I don't really think the James Bond movies are supposed to be just so damn serious as they've become. And I think the problem, in part, is the Batman movies. Because when Christian Bale came on and Chris Nolan came on with Batman, whenever that was, the mid-2000s, the Batman movies took a much darker turn. And this is sort of a cyclical thing, it seems, with Batman, is that they were campy in the 60s with the old Adam West character, and then they got dark in the 80s with Michael Keaton and Tim Burton, and then they got stupid and campy again with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Val Kilmer. But then they got dark again with Christian Bale. And to take nothing away from the Batman movies, I think they've been very good movies, but I don't think they need you need to replicate that with another franchise the way they have with James Bond. I mean, Skyfall was certainly very dark, just visually, and I think Spectre kind of has that same problem, that there's a lot of nighttime shots that you wouldn't have seen back in the day of James Bond. And I think in a way, Sam Mendes and the franchise are trying to have it both ways, that they want to follow this James Bond formula, which in some respects is just so tired, while at the same time trying to be darker and give it more weight than it really deserves. I'm kind of hoping that they're going to get a James Bond who's a little bit more old school and maybe has a little bit more of a wink with a lot of this material. But just to talk a little bit about the formulaic elements of the new James Bond movies, the reason it's called Spectre is because back in the 60s, they had a character named Blofeld who was the head of this international organization of villains that was called Spectre. And in the earlier James Bond movies, you had various actors playing the Blofeld character. Donald Pleasance played it, and You Only Live Twice, and then actor named Charles Gray, I believe it was, played it, and Diamonds Are Forever. And he was this guy who wore a gray Nehru jacket, and he petted a fluffy white cat. And Mike Myers had a lot of fun with this in the Austin Powers movies. And so I kind of figured once Austin Powers came out, that would be it. That would be the end of the Blofeld character and this formula that had been going on in the James Bond movies for years and years. But here we are in 2015, and we're back to the Blofeld character. And I guess at some level that's okay. I mean, the Batman movies went back to doing the Joker again. After Jack Nicholson had did it, and then they did it in the Christian Bale movies, and the Joker was a huge hit with the newer Batman movies, and people talk about that character all the time. I don't think you see that kind of level of acting in this new James Bond movie. Christoph Waltz is the new Blofeld, and I love Christoph Waltz. I think he's a great actor, and he does what he can with the material inspector, but there's really not a whole lot that he can do. It's just kind of the usual stuff going on where you have the scene where James Bond shows up at the bad guy's lair, and rather than just kill him, they show him around. They show him everything that's going on, the plan, the hardware, the big rooms with people in matching suits sitting at monitors. And this has not changed since the very first few James Bond movies. I mean, this is the same stuff. It looks better. Special effects are better. The set design is better, but it's the same damn thing. So it's kind of surprising to see. And Christoph Waltz does what he can. There's a really I thought uncomfortable torture scene in this, and it's another thing in movies why it seems like they need to do this in PG-13 movies, which they can't show any nudity, but they have a horrifying torture scene, and Bond is tortured with a drill, kind of like a dentist drill that goes into his skull, which I don't know why they feel the need to put these kind of scenes in. I mean, it's one thing to have James Bond strapped down, but back in the day, there wouldn't actually be any blood drawn, and that was fine. But anyway, I guess they want to give the scene more menace than they used to. And so James Bond, obviously, I don't think I'm giving away any spoilers here to say that he escapes and he brings it all down, and the bad guy gets his, and Spectre gives a little bit of a backstory to the Blofeld character. In the early James Bond movies, he always had a scar, and in this movie, when you first see Blofeld, he doesn't have the scar, and later he gets it. So they're providing backstory for Blofeld, which I don't think it needs that, but it's the usual James Bond elements, and wrapped up in kind of a different way. And that's kind of been my issue with the newer James Bond movies. Since Daniel Craig was chosen as Bond, they've, Miss Moneypenny is a little bit different because she's black rather than white. M was different because she was a woman rather than a man, but then they killed off her character, and now M is a man again. So it's kind of this constant back and forth with the James Bond, where they're trying to doing something new while sticking to the old formula. And I don't know. I'm just hoping they do something different next time around. I'm not really sure what they should do. I mean, I'm just a guy sitting there watching the movie, but it's just not ringing very true anymore. And Spectre was was entertaining at times. I thought the opening was great, where they set it in Mexico City during the Day of the Dead celebrations. I thought that was very interesting, something I'd never seen in a movie before. And there's a really interesting shot of Daniel Craig on a rooftop. This kind of this unbroken shot where he's walking across the top of a building, holding a gun before he takes down some assassins. And I thought that was a great shot. But then there's this fight scene on a helicopter that goes on too long. This is before the opening credits. And can I just say, I think it is time to retire the James Bond opening credits. It was pretty silly in this movie. And they do it. It's a traditional thing, but it seems like it's 15 minutes long. And the graphics were just really silly. I think they could probably do something a little different, maybe in the next James Bond movie. Again, no one in Hollywood cares what I think. But just from a guy who's sitting there for 2.5 hours, and that's another thing. A 2.5 hour James Bond movie. I mean, my God. The Godfather, I think, was 20 minutes longer than this James Bond movie, The Godfather, which, has 100 people in it and a lot of plot and, 3 generations of the Corleones coming through. So, okay, Godfather, 170 minutes or whatever it is. I can understand that. But James Bond, 2.5 hours. I mean, my wife and I, we saw it, and it was great to be out. But sometimes, you want to get a drink afterward. You want to have a little fun doing something else when you're out. But if you're watching James Bond for 2.5 hours, that's pretty much your night. So we had to get back and make sure all the kids were doing okay. So, and that's a whole nother topic is why every movie nowadays seems to be 2.5 hours long. I'm not sure, but a bit long for a James Bond movie. And I don't think the previous one, Skyfall, was a whole lot shorter. So I don't know. Again, James Bond, he's one of those guys. I like the movies. I want them to be good. I'm a fan. I've been a fan, ever since I can remember while watching movies. But it's tough. They have to come up with something new every 5 or 10 years. Either it be a new actor or kind of a new way directing things or a new tone. And I think it's worn a little bit thin with Daniel Craig, and I think he knows it. And maybe he'll do one more, maybe not. I don't know. It seems like he was a bit upset about this movie. I know there was some bad press before it even came out that he was getting upset at people talking about him or the movie or whatever it was. But maybe, they need to focus a little bit more on what's actually going on in the world, and maybe do a movie about that. If James Bond's going to save us from terrorism, maybe it makes sense to have it be some kind of terrorism that we actually encounter or we see in the news, rather than this sort of made-up pastiche from the 60s. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents about James Bond. Obviously an enormously successful character and very successful franchise. I think Skyfall made $1 billion, and Spectre had a really big weekend too, and of course I was there. So, always hope for the best with James Bond, just like any franchise. I think we're all hoping for the best with Star Wars, even though, I don't know. I hope I'm not disappointed. The last 3 movies were pretty disappointing, but Lucas isn't involved this time, so maybe they'll be actually good. I don't know. Anyway, well, I've blathered on here for almost 45 minutes, so I think I'm gonna end it right there. Hey, first podcast, it's done. It was about movies. Love talking about movies, and hopefully I'll have more time to do something like this. Hope anyone that listens to it enjoyed it. And I don't really know where this is gonna go. I would like to just keep talking. Obviously, no one can cancel me. But I would love to talk to some other people out there. Would love to do interviews. I know this isn't Los Angeles, this is in New York City, but maybe if I make some calls to people I know in Richmond or someone else, I could sit down with some people and do interviews, because I know people love hearing interviews, and I've done a couple interviews in my life, but nothing too long form. But if I can talk for 45 minutes, I think anyone out there who would be willing to talk to me can certainly match that. And I would love to talk for an hour or two with other people about whatever. Obviously, I know historians, and they're great people, but the sky's the limit. What the heck? So anyway, thanks again for listening. I will be back talking about something else very soon. Not sure exactly what. Maybe I'll talk about movies again. Maybe I will. I don't know. There's a lot to talk about, and I'll be doing it with you soon. Thanks.